Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Milton Villavicencio wash processed Ecuador from Jimmy Bean's Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Jimmy Bean's, based out of Chicago, Illinois. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Finca Brewing a wash processed Costa Rican coffee. And if you watched that review, then you heard us mention that Jimmy Bean's is technically no longer in business. However, the person that did roast this coffee does have their own business now called Shoebox Coffee Roasters. So once again, I will include their link down below for anybody that is interested. But while we were having our conversation about which coffees we were going to purchase from Jimmy Bean's, this is the one that immediately caught my interest, as we do review a lot of Ecuadorian coffees these days. However, it's very rare that we review an average caturra coffee. So when I found out that they were going to be carrying one of those, it felt like a great opportunity to revisit a varietal from an origin that we haven't done a very good job of covering in the last couple of years. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a higher extraction one at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, once again, they have it listed by their standards as being very light. And again, I mentioned in our previous Jimmy Bean's review that Max was pretty heavily inspired by H&S. And once again, I would say that this coffee is pretty close to being on par with H&S's standard light offerings, as I wouldn't necessarily say that they offer that same level of lightness that those ultralight coffees do. And in some ways that works out pretty well for these coffees, as it doesn't take quite as long to start working on them. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was pretty much in line with the expectations that we did have for it, as it offered a classic approach to an Ecuadorian coffee with some slight sugariness, the illicit apple-like brightness, plenty of directness and traditionality to it, especially with the coffee improving as it cooled down. And as I kind of mentioned, the main reason this coffee spoke to me so much was because it just was a great opportunity to remind me of what Ecuadorian coffees used to be like, as that was the first impression I had of this coffee, was a much more traditional experience for an Ecuadorian coffee, as opposed to all of the Mejorado and Sidra coffees that offer a much more unique profile to them. We move on to day 25, as we opted for the Chemex, and it does continue to offer a traditional South American profile with great sugariness and terrific clarity, especially in terms of the apple-like brightness yet again. It does present some slight tropicality in the cool down, adding a little bit of depth to it as well, so just a little bit of additional characteristics within this experience. We move on to day 28, as we opted for the April brewer, and the coffee was notably more tart and bright, as it's much more in line with the listed green apple, where the tartness became a bit of an overly dominant characteristic on this day. Pretty direct in that sense, with an abundance of the complementary sugary sweetness yet again. So two notes we have on here, I want to say green apple and pie crust, and given that it is a South American caturra coffee, then that's something that I was fully expecting within this, but a lot of those other additional caturra characteristics would be felt from this point going forward, as well as on day 31, we opted for the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, once again going in the direction of what we usually go for with H&S's coffees: higher temperatures, lower concentration, a more fine grind. And the coffee is improved overall, as it's offering plenty of those caturra-like characteristics with a prominent brightness and a very lingering sense, as the listed apple does continue to feel apt with a prominent brightness and even a slight spearmint quality at the end. So that was a little unique, something that I hadn't necessarily experienced too much as of this moment, but even then I would say a lot of positivity within that experience. We move on to day 34, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee has had great consistency as it continues to offer that tartness yet again with the traditional feel. This day did skew even heavier in that direction, as it continues to remain, we'll say, pretty sugary, pretty intense, pretty bright and tart throughout. Day 37, through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it feels like there could be a little bit more to this coffee, as it felt like it benefited more from being pushed a little harder, as this has some nice intensity, but it felt relatively toned down to some of the previous days, as this time it was a bit too one note, not necessarily offering as much of the depth that we'd experienced from the higher extraction days that we had experienced just before. So definitely felt like some adjustments were needed. We tried it once again on day 40 with the Chemex and our standard recipe, as it felt like it was back to being at its best. A lot of those caturra-like characteristics, plenty of that apple yet again, sweet and direct, another really nice day of this coffee. So on day 43, that's the direction we decided to go with this one, as we opted for the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments once again. And it did feel like the coffee might have dropped off ever so slightly with time, as it felt like these last three experiences weren't the same extent as we experienced in that kind of middle ground day 31. Day 34 mark, as it's still pretty direct with that apple-like tartness. Some additional aspects include a slightly dark berry and citric tone to it, that caturra-like molasses and honey, which is something that we've been alluding to a fair bit, and a bit of a caramelized sugary sweetness to this coffee as well. So just a little bit more depth, but a lot of those characteristics, a lot of things you'd expect from a much more traditional South American coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And one thing I should note, it's kind of interesting because here on this day 54 mark, it's actually the best it has been to this point. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the coffee dropped off as of that moment. I feel like maybe it just wasn't necessarily the best adjustments we had made to the coffee. So it actually does feel improved. So I don't necessarily think that that note of it dropping off with time may have held out to be true. All right, tasting wheel, let's go through it real quick. And we have a handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Certainly nothing whatsoever to take away with the overall cleanliness of this coffee, especially given that a lot of the characteristics within this one are pretty direct, as the sweetness, the intensity, and a lot of that really bright aspect to this one are presented in a pretty well-defined sense, so definitely justified there in that mark. Finish, level 4. And the finish, I would say, for the most part, skews a little bit more on that darker side of things. So I'm experiencing in that last sip a bit more of that kind of lingering, dark, like molasses-like aspect to it, maybe a little bit more of a darker honey-like feel to it. So a lot of those kind of caturra-like qualities within this one. Sweetness, level 4, and I'm very happy with the sweetness of this coffee. That's something that I've been very happy with. All of the coffees we'd reviewed from Jimmy Beans is that they do offer that higher than average level of sweetness, especially for a coffee like this. And these are the types of coffees that I actually find to be a guilty pleasure that I very much enjoy reviewing. I remember there was a coffee from Flower Child we had, I want to say last year, that was also an Ecuadorian coffee, and it was a pretty standard varietal. And anytime we get an opportunity to review a coffee like this that does have a lighter profile to it while still presenting that more traditional feel, it gives me a bit of nostalgia at the same time of a more modern approach to those coffees. So the sweetness being as high as it is really appreciated with a coffee like this. Acidity, level 4, pretty bright, and I would say bright enough to justify that level 4 mark, given it's on par with your average Kenyan coffee in that sense, but that was probably expected going into it, given the overall impression that I had of this coffee. Citrus fruit, level 4, that's 100% the apple-like characteristics to it. When Max first mentioned to me that this coffee was basically going to be a green apple pie, I'm like, okay, that's something that I'm definitely looking forward to, and it definitely lived up to that, as it's probably one of the most defined and well-presented green apple-like coffee I think we've experienced in quite a bit, so definitely some credits to that. We move on to the level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. It does have a little bit, once again, of that kind of darker honey-like florality to it, so that felt justified there at that higher mark. Berry fruit, level 3, and I feel like that's a little bit more of that traditional coffee feel to it, definitely feeling a little bit more of those darker berry aspects, presented in a somewhat more subtle, contrasting sense to the more bright, tart aspects of this coffee. Caramel, level 3, and I'm not entirely sure whether or not that's just what this coffee is or if it's once again a component of the Diedrich, but I was very happy with the more kind of caramelized brown sugar, that very sugary sweet characteristic that was presented within this one, because that's what makes up the majority of the sweetness within this coffee. So very happy with that, scoring there at that level 3 mark. Final thing worth discussing, body, level 3. So this one also had a fair bit of texture, even though we made this tasting wheel with the Chemex, which goes to show that it still had a little bit more of those traditional characteristics to it, adding some additional depth to this coffee. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It just dawned on me as I was thinking about what I wanted to say on this coffee that it's a lot of those coffees in the Cafe Box Advent calendar that are similar to this that I enjoy as much as I do. So when I get a pretty lightly profiled standard washed Guatemalan coffee, or something similar that's like a Honduran coffee or an El Salvadorian coffee, when they have that sort of presentation to them that's both traditional, light, and more modern, then I'm really big fans of those coffees because they just seem to offer a much more unique characteristic that I don't think is really seen as often as it should be these days. Usually when it comes to coffees, I want to say of Ecuadorian nature now, they do tend to be those Mejerados, those Sidras, and while I definitely enjoy those Mejerado coffees as much as I do, it's really nice to go back and try something like this. And that appealed to me right from the start when it was brought up as a coffee we could potentially review, and it definitely lived up to that as I enjoyed the entire experience for what it was. And I keep going back to that coffee that we'd reviewed from Flower Child last year because that was another example of one of those coffees where I'm like, this just reminds me of a lot of the coffees that I was drinking, I want to say 8-9 years ago. It just presented in a slightly lighter sense. So I really appreciate this coffee for what it was, and once again, it kind of comes off as a guilty pleasure in that sense. My second favorite of the 3 coffees that we did review from Jimmy Beans. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, same manner in which I've been discussing for the majority of this review. If you do like your slightly more traditional South American coffees, and this one offers plenty of those characteristics to it, it is your boring washed caturra coffee, and as a result you're experiencing a lot of those classic characteristics, but all of them are presented in a sweeter, lighter profiled and brighter sense to it as well. So it does give it just a bit more intensity in that regard, and that makes it a very enjoyable drink throughout, and it did have some very nice consistency. So I feel like that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Milton Villavicencio wash processed Ecuador from Jimmy Beans Coffee. Thank you for watching.